The agenda is set. The First World War, a century on, and we're still editing the history. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. It's time to talk. Defeated and the politics of memory. How much should Germany remember? Victory over the top. Is Britain blinded by the glory of the Great War? And the battle that never ended, Turks and Armenians, and when to say genocide. Oh, welcome to the show, everyone. I've invited three people today to remember with me, to examine efforts to commemorate modernity's first tumble into the abyss. Armenia says that this anniversary of the beginning of the First World War is the right time for Turkey to own up to the genocide committed against Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during the war. Well, Tessa Hofmann has written extensively on the Armenian Genocide, and she does not think that this issue will be resolved soon. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Tessa, good to have you on the show with us. In Britain, efforts to glorify the war have just as much to do with current politics as they do with history. That is how Neil Faulkner explains it. He is one of the UK's leading World War I historians, and he's fighting to keep the glory out of war memory. Neil, it's good to have you on the show with us today. And my next guest has tremendous influence on the public narrative about the First World War right here in Germany. She is the co-curator of the First World War exhibition at the German Historical Museum here in Berlin. Juliane Haubold-Stolle is with us today. Juliane, it's good to have you on the show. Do Germans want to remember and commemorate what happened back in 1914?
Yes, they're very much interested in the First World War right now. We have many visitors, more than 800 each day, which is quite a lot for our museum, up to, I think, 29,000 since the opening on the last day of May. And it's not only us in Berlin commemorating the war, but also more than, I think, 80 to 90 exhibitions all over Germany.
You're the curator, so and what is the message? I mean, what's the message they take away?
We wanted to present the First World War in its own right, because largely in Germany, the First World War has been overshadowed by the Second World War and the remembrance of that. And now we wanted to tell and to show the German people what happened during this war and how it changed the 20th century. And we try to do this not only, of course, in a German perspective, but to put the other perspective also in it.
Okay, there are other perspectives, but let me ask everyone at the table here. When you think of Germany and the First World War, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Do you think of the loser of the war, partly the cause of the war?
Well, I certainly don't. I think of two Germanys. I think of the Germany of the bankers, the industrialists, the generals, just as I think there are two Britons at the same time. There's a Britain of the bankers and the industrialists and the generals, and on both sides of the divide, most ordinary working people are victims of the war. So the way we should be thinking about it in Germany, I think, is not so very different from the way in which we should be thinking about it in Britain.
What would you say, Tessa?
Well, similar to this, I would also say it's a situation where I focus on the civic population, on the non-combatants.
The victims.
Yes, who became the victims for very complex reasons, such as starvation, diseases in Europe, but also in areas at the fringe of Europe.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. We're talking today. We're dedicating the whole show to the First World War. Every year, we in the media turn our attention to the anniversary of the beginning and the end of the Second World War. We do not treat the First World War equally, and we really never have. The First World War seems and is much more distant. It is history. There are no longer shared memories that we can talk about. And that's perhaps one answer to the critics who say that Germany appears indifferent to the anniversary. Well, the German Chancellor, she has offered an explanation for this, saying that the nation's focus on its guilt for the terror of the Nazi era and for the Holocaust, well, it hasn't really left much room for remembering another war.
In May, the German Chancellor was at Berlin's German Historical Museum to open the new exhibition about the First World War. It shows the horrors suffered by soldiers on all sides, as well as civilians. The German government's critics say the show is one of the few events it has helped organize to mark the anniversary. Germany is spending about €4.5 million on commemorations. The UK and France are each spending around 60 million, well over 10 times as much. Is Germany trying to sweep the history of World War I under the carpet?
What do you say to that? Is there an attempt to ignore this anniversary?
I don't think it's an attempt to ignore it. And I would like to add, because I think sometimes a little bit unfair, we have a federalist system, and almost all the culture is organized by the regions, the Länder, or the cities. So, and there are many cities and regions spending a lot of money on events covering the First World War. So we should include this in the effort of whole of Germany. But I understand that there has been sort of hesitation by the federal government to address this topic.
And where's that coming from?
I think, the whole of Germany is trying to coming to terms with this war, and it's not that easy. First of all, we lost it, and it has it's not easy to put a sense to this war. There has been no triumph, no victory, and the outcome of the war was even more problematic than the starting of the war. And the second explanation is then that in the interwar period, the whole topic of the war guilt, of why and who started the First World War, was really a heavy discussion. And the National Socialists, they used the war guilt and the remembrance of the First World War for their rise and for the propaganda for the Second World War, for the revenge war.
Yeah, I mean,
so after the Second World War, Germany tried to come to terms with the guilt of the Second World War and the Shoah, and now I think there is a discussion about the First World War.
Is it easy though? Is it maybe perhaps it's easier for Britain and for France to talk about two separate wars? Is it in Germany's collective psyche? Isn't the First and the Second World Wars, aren't they almost like twin events?
Yes, almost like twin events, but with a very small twin, the First World War, and the huge and the bigger one, of course, the Second World War. The First World War one is seen in school books normally, for example, as prehistory for the Second World War. Not only the First World War, but
creating the situation.
By creating the situation in Europe.
Yes, I mean, so it's equally as important because it paved the way.
It's important, but yes, that's why we address it in a huge exposition at the moment. And we would like to show people that it is worthwhile to look at this war to understand what happened afterwards.
There are politicians here in Germany who say it is it's a shame and it's an embarrassment that the federal government has not earmarked as much money to commemorate this event in comparison with the French or the British. Is it about money? I mean, is money an indicator of a society's willingness to address its past?
Well, I would say money may be one, but not the only indicator. Another one is research. And if we compare the research done on the First and the Second World War and consequences, we clearly have a picture that you describe with the tiny twin and the very huge brother. The research is emphasizing clearly on the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, it's also to do, isn't it, with how you use the money. I mean, if you spend money to commemorate a British military victory, if you spend money but you ignore the Armenian Genocide, if you spend money in a way which is promoting some kind of nationalist ideology, which is what the British government is doing, that is not money well spent. We want to learn the lessons of history so that we don't repeat the mistakes of history.
There is a criticism, though, that there is no major ceremony marking the start of the conflict scheduled here in Germany. That is, I mean, when I read that, I thought, okay, that must be, you know, a misprint, a typo. I mean, it's hard to imagine, because isn't Germany, based on what we know from World War II, Germany is almost like the poster child for coming to terms with the sins of the past, reconciliation. But with World War I, it feels like it's dropping the ball.
Perhaps there's a truth in it. I think it is not yet decided how Germany as a whole, or how in the mainstream we really think about this war. It is easy for us, for Germans, to concentrate on a picture of a war which imagines us, every people in Europe, to be a victim of this war, because then we do not have to talk about the starting of the war and responsibility for that. And we know now. We had a discussion, a public discussion, after many people read the book of Christopher Clark, and many people were fascinated by it. And it's like, well, now we have an Australian telling us, perhaps we are not responsible for the First World War after all.
Right. I mean,
so
I mean, enough time has passed. Yeah.
You know, and then you have all that what follows, because if we are not responsible for the First World War, perhaps there is something to be said that we are not that guilty for the Second World War, because it hangs together.
Or maybe, you know, since Germany lost both wars, maybe losing 2 world wars in the same century, maybe that's just too much for a society to process equally. I mean, do we expect too much of Germany?
I mean, I want to pick up this idea of German guilt, you see, because there is no sense at all in which modern German people have a responsibility for the First World War or the Nazi period. There is no sense in which millions of Germans at the time had responsibility for the First World War or for the Nazi period. Germany was and is a class-divided society. It was Germany's rulers that went to war in 1914, just as Britain's rulers went to war in 1914. There's no collective German guilt. I think there's a collective guilt on the part of the rulers of the whole of Europe in 1914. It was the rulers of Europe who led the world into the abyss.
That's not the narrative that we hear, though, is it, Neil? I mean, we still hear a narrative of, even with World War I, there was the good side and there was the bad side. But this notion of the leaders being culpable and the leaders of all the countries basically being cut from the same cloth, you don't hear that.
Well, the British controlled in 1914 the biggest empire in the world. They had engaged the Germans in a shipbuilding contest, and they had a fleet that was twice the size of Germany's. They'd formed alliances which surrounded Germany in Europe. It's not that surprising that Germany's rulers saw Britain as the aggressor. So this whole idea that it's good one side, bad the other, needs to be completely deconstructed.
What about the notion, though, that I've heard that it was just the reasons actually, when you look back, are just plain stupid? Because you had this balance of power, you had all of these agreements that just sucked people in. Why didn't someone say, we're not going to go to war?
There were many people who tried to say we're not going to war.
I think in retrospect we often forget the way of thinking at those times, and what you suggest is very much our contemporary thinking.
Right.
But at that time it was simply not on.
I think Tessa's right that there was lots more deference towards authority at the time, but I think it's also right for us to say in the 4 days before Germany went to war, it's estimated there were 750,000 Germans involved in anti-war demonstrations. Now, there was a view right the way across Europe in the trade unions and the socialist parties that there should be mass action to stop war if the leaders led Europe into war. And all of the leaderships of the unions and the socialist parties, they capitulated when their own rulers started banging the war drums.
Let me pick up, before we move on to the German Chancellor one more time, she has said that maybe Germany seems not so interested in this anniversary because Germany wants to focus on reconciliation and show that former enemies have learned from their mistakes. And she says Europe's unification is the true lesson that we take from that history. I mean, that sounds very smart, very wise, that those stupid mistakes that I was talking about can't happen anymore because you have the EU. So maybe she's talking the talk that the British need to be talking more of. What do you say to that?
What I would say, I think that's very, very complicated, Brent, because you see, I don't think we have a united Europe. I think we have a deeply divided Europe, with the rich and the bankers on one side squeezing public services and working people right the way across Europe. You've only got to look at the great demonstrations in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, and so on, to show that this is not a united Europe. This is a Europe of the rich.
The threat is no longer there that France and Germany are going to go to war with each other. And that's what Merkel, she talks about that a lot. That threat is no longer there.
Yeah, but that has a lot to do with the Second World War too, of course. Huh? It's not only the First World War. And perhaps she's right. To talk with each other and to think about how national interests, however we can define them, and if there are national interests, should be balanced all over Europe. That's better than going to war about it.
Yeah.
But of course, we have other regions, and with which Europe may very well is at war at the moment, and will perhaps go to war. So the situation has perhaps changed in Europe, but with the crisis in Ukraine, we see it can very well change back again. So
we need to move on. Ukraine, though, is a good point. Keep the conversation going on Twitter and Facebook with us. Hashtag DW Agenda. Let us know what you think about the way Germany sees this anniversary. Well, I hope you can join me on Thursday for DW's live coverage from Ypres, Belgium. That's the site of some of the bloodiest fighting in the First World War. Heads of states from across Europe will gather to observe the 100th anniversary of the start of the Great War. Now, you may have to look extra carefully to see any European Union flags. British officials have reportedly asked their continental counterparts to refrain from displaying the EU flag during ceremonies connected to 1914. The word from London: we don't want commemoration services to be about EU politics. Now, that struck me as very odd. The EU, for all of its faults, is the symbol of what the Europeans have gotten right after all the wrongs of 2 major wars, but not everyone on the other side of the English Channel sees it that way.
Britain marks the end of World War I every year with grand commemorations. But for the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the fighting, the British government wants to do much more. It's planning to spend tens of millions, and ministers say they want to change the way the war is remembered. Education Minister Michael Gove, for example, stirred up controversy by saying Britain should not focus on incompetent generals who led millions of soldiers to die pointless deaths. Instead, he wants to celebrate patriotism, honor, and courage. He says Britain should remember World War I as a just war. and that one country was to blame for starting it: Germany.
And that's the message.
Yes, indeed. It's the message that's coming from the British government, which is, I think, wanting to reconfigure the way in which we think about the First World War in Britain, which traditionally has been as a terrible tragedy for British people and for the people across the world. That has been the traditional view of the First World War since the time of the war, reflecting the huge revulsion that there was in British society towards the end of the war and in the early post-war years. They want to reconfigure it as a message now about heroism, glory, and necessary sacrifice.
And where's that coming from?
I think it's coming from a preoccupation with the projection of military power in the modern world into the Middle East, into Central Asia. It's a neo-imperialism which lies behind this, a desire to use military power to protect Western interests in other parts of the world. So what do you do in relation to the First World War? You reconfigure it as a story, a positive story about Britain.
I mean, what's wrong, though, Neil, with the government, with the state, talking about the sacrifices that were made, and also highlighting the fact that Britain, that they won the war, and that perhaps Europe was better off had they lost, the war.
Britain's rulers won the war, and because they won the war, they therefore carved up the world in a way that was in their interest. So they, for example, carved up the Middle East, they grabbed the German colonies in Africa, just as the Germans would have carved up the world in their interest had they won. But both sides were fighting a war for empire and profit in the interests of their own ruling classes. That was the reality of the First World War. And all of those British boys who died in the war or were maimed in the war, they went back to the slums and to unemployment, and we had another world war a generation later. That was the outcome of the First World War for Britain.
The message that I see when I'm reading anything from the UK about this is that World War I was a fight that needed to be fought. And I'm asking myself, where was the need?
Absolutely.
And
because what had happened was a profoundly dysfunctional global system had been created, where there was a division of the world between different banking syndicates and industrial conglomerates, a division of the world into different empires, a division of the world into different nation states, all armed to the teeth.
But are people saying that in the UK that at the time, Great Britain was the premier empire power on the globe? What I read a lot coming out of the UK is that you had Germany, you had its allies wanting to pursue imperialistic goals, and it's written about and talked about in the UK as if that was something foreign to the British people in 1914.
Yes, absolutely. The British Empire is the good empire. That's the way in which it is being presented by the right, by the political right in Britain, by the government, by revisionist historians. Now, that would be news to Irish people. It would be news to Egyptians. It would be news to most Indians at the time, because the British had more subject people living under their rule than anybody else in the world at the time. So actually, it was in the interests of all of those people that the British were defeated, so that British imperialism was weakened, and it was easier.
What you're saying is something, this notion that the powers were basically the same. That's something that you rarely hear in Germany when you're talking about the way the world looked in 1914, because it's that guilt and that culpability that always steals the limelight. I mean, let me ask the Germans at the table. I mean, do you agree?
I agree, but I think there's nothing wrong in looking critically at its own history. So before you start to criticize other people for their version of history, perhaps you should look at what you're telling yourself. And so it's good if we look at what German rulers did in 1914. And you don't only, well, that's I would like to add, you don't only have the beginning of the war, but you also have the way the war was fought in 14 till 18. And there, well, we won't see really great differences. But, for example, alone the decision,
weapons.
yes, the use of chemical weapons, well, there are lots more, but the decision to invade neutral Belgium was, well, a military decision by Germans military, but the politicians did not protest. In France, there also was a military and the military idea to invade Belgium because it's faster to come to Germany. But the politicians protested because, well, it's not possible. We won't do that. And there's a difference there. So even if you don't talk about only about the starting of the war, the decisions that followed after the war, when the war was on, were also different. The Germans decided to use poison gas, deathly poison gas, for the first time. The others did not. Well, it had a lot to do with German chemistry being very advanced and also German chemical industry being advanced, but, well, the decision was there.
Let me get back to, before we move on to what's coming out of the UK, you know, there is a piece that was written by Max Hastings this week about the ceremonies that are going to take place on Thursday. And I'm struck by his ability to take this commemoration event and to turn it around and to talk about the Germans pushing for a federal system in Europe and the UK having to pull out of Europe as a consequence. And he's saying that what we fought for in 1914, we're actually losing in 2014. I read that and I was stunned. And you're fighting against this type of
Well, I mean,
narrative.
there's no question that the political right in Britain is I mean the right of the Tory party and UKIP are strongly anti-EU and are using the First World War as a way of talking about EU politics today. That's definitely something that is going on in Britain. I think what complicates this, Brent, is the way in which the EU, not just in Britain but right across Europe, has become very, very unpopular, because austerity, privatisation and financialisation is hardwired into the way the EU is operating, which is creating massive levels of alienation from the EU, from the whole European project, from the European elites, and the right is tapping into that in Britain as elsewhere.
But I still find it's amazing that even, you know, the right would use something like the anniversary of World War I to fuel anti-EU sentiment today, because that's like comparing apples and oranges. One has nothing to do with the other. And I'm wondering, do the British people, do they realize that these two things don't really connect?
Well, I suspect that there are lots of people who are gulled by that quite simplistic argument, but I agree with you completely that they're not comparing the same thing. I think what Juliane said about the EU and peace is worth emphasising, that I think probably the EU creates a framework which makes European peace more likely. But what it also does is it creates a platform for the projection of military power beyond the borders of the EU. And the Ukraine crisis is a classic example of that. That has got quite tense because the EU is pushing into Eastern Europe, covered by NATO, and that is actually ratcheting up the level of military tension inside Europe more generally.
Okay, so we're back talking about a level of militarism that actually 100 years of history is supposed to have removed. Before we move on, let me just read you something that Max Hastings wrote here. He's saying, you know, that the men who died in Belgium, if they were to come back today, you know, he said that they would be amazed to see the rubble has been turned into manicured prosperity, and they would be amazed to see the scene of a summit of EU nations overwhelmingly dominated by mighty Germany. let me ask our Germans at the table, how do you feel, how do you react when you're being demonized in the UK for something that happened 100 years ago?
Well, I think in general, demonization is always a threat to understanding, to the balance of interest and so on. So we should avoid that. But
yeah, but does it make you angry? Because it's not. I mean, it
does not make me personally angry. But I see in all simplifications, I see a certain danger, and we are now in a crisis in the EU. You mentioned that rightly. We are in the danger that there is increasing gap between the South and the North in Europe, maybe also the East and the West. And so we have to think about, we have to reflect commonalities. And coming back to our topic of the First World War, the commonality that I would emphasize are imperialist interests. Britain had, Germany had, Germany rather as a starting imperial power.
Right, Germany wanted to be like the UK and France. I mean,
and just one topic that I quite well know, Germany, for example, had the intention to start a jihad, and that was the basis of the German-Ottoman alliance in the war. And Germany sacrificed for this jihad project everything, but the jihad, which was intended by Germany to bring to rebellion the people in the British and French colonies, actually, in the first place, turned against the indigenous Christians in the Ottoman
exactly,
Empire.
It backfired. Exactly,
yes.
It did. We need to move on. Keep the conversation going on Twitter and Facebook. Hashtag DW Agenda. Let us know what you think about Britain's role in the way that this anniversary is being commemorated. All right, World War I marks many terrible firsts in the 20th century. Warfare with tanks, machine guns, chemical weapons, we've already said that. It is also when the first genocide of the century took place. And that is what Armenians say, pointing to events which began in 1915 as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. Well, 99 years have come and gone, and Turkey's position on that charge has not changed.
Historians estimate around 1.5 million Armenians were killed by Ottoman Turks during the First World War, the first genocide of the 20th century. Turkey has never accepted those numbers, nor the description of what happened as a genocide. The issue still poisons relations between Armenia and Turkey. But there has been some improvement. This year, Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan took the unprecedented move of offering his condolences to Armenia. But he didn't go so far as to use the word genocide. The Armenian president said Turkey is still in utter denial.
And when I consider what we've been talking about so far, about how the rhetoric is right now, it's hard to imagine that Turkey is going to change its position.
Well, it is very slowly, gradually changing the position. Starting in the mid-1990s, an increasing number of Turkish scholars, of authors, intellectuals came out and publicly agreed with the assumption that there was an Armenian genocide. Until 2008, don't let us forget, such persons acknowledging historic facts were prosecuted by law. There was the notorious Penal Code paragraph 301, now replaced by the terrorist law if you wish to prosecute people. But nevertheless, that was a severe obstacle for a free debate in the Turkish society.
Okay,
but things are gradually improving.
Okay, but you're still not going to get Recep Tayyip Erdogan to say, or to even begin to acknowledge culpability in a genocide. I mean, he's nowhere near that.
Yes, he did a more important step in the context of another genocide committed by the Turkish army in 1938. And with regards to millions of Alevi voters in his country, he came as near to recognition as saying this was a slaughter, a massacre.
Yeah, a massacre. Explain to us, what is the danger, what is the risk of admitting that a genocide happened? Is he worried about having to pay reparations, or is he worried about the Turkish identity being put into question?
This and many other factors. You cannot lie to your people for about 100 years and then come out and tell the people, sorry, so far we didn't tell you the truth, but now we acknowledge facts. That is...
Why not? I mean, people...
Psychologically, it is very difficult, and it is, of course, also ruining the rest of trust that the Turkish population
But wouldn't
may have.
it build trust to say we have not been as fair as we should be with our Armenian neighbors, and we'd like to change that?
Not Armenian neighbors, sorry, but this was a domestic genocide, a state...
I'm talking about as it is now, though.
Yeah.
But, I mean, why not take this opportunity? 100 years, the opportunity's there. Let's do some housekeeping with the way we've treated history.
I reckon that the number of those who would really be furious about such a governmental step is much larger still than the number of those who welcome it. And Erdogan is a very sharply calculating politician. So he would not dare to provoke with a G word.
Right. What about forces from outside? Does the EU, France, for example, or the United States, the State Department, do they have to keep exerting pressure on Turkey? Is that what will eventually bring Turkey
That's
to say
at
the truth?
least what I hear from Turkish human rights defenders, that they would welcome outside impulses. But let us return to Germany. Germany and Turkey share one thing. They both do not go that far that they use the word genocide to legally evaluate what happened in 1915 and 16 in the Ottoman Empire. The German government legislator had issued a resolution in 2005 which described the events as massacres and deportations without using genocide.
It's a matter of syntax, basically, right? And I know it has legal repercussions, but let me broaden it out because we're running out of time. The point here is that there is serious unfinished business from that war that is not being attended to 100 years on.
The past, is always about the present. I mean, the way in which we talk about history is related to what is going on in the present. And I think Tessa's absolutely right. I think the Turkish state, and crucially the Turkish army, the credibility of that organisation is undermined if, after 100 years of lying, they admit to this. And it's not just the Armenian Holocaust, it's also that truth has a tendency of cascading. So if we can tell the truth about the worst single atrocity, perhaps a whole lot of other information begins to come out about the way in which the Turkish Republic was created, because there's good and bad there. There's the driving out of the Greeks. There's the sectarian way in which that war was fought. Now, there needs to be an accounting in general inside Turkish society with Turkish history, with that record.
We're running out of time. We've only got about a minute left. Let's talk about what's happening in the Middle East and the connection to the end of World War I. The lines as they're drawn for Syria, for Iraq, are a direct result of what happened between 1914 and 1918, 1919. Is there the possibility that this anniversary will give a new impetus, a new impulse to world leaders to accept culpability for the mess that we're dealing with and to try to make things right?
If you see the desperate situation of the Christian remnants in the Near East, which was once Ottoman territory, the consequence would be to prevent a second genocide. That's what the Christians in Iraq, in Syria, many of them being survivors of the First World War genocide, feel about.
And do you think there is that danger now of ethnic cleansing happening?
It is already going on, and there is the option either to leave, and the terror of Islamist paramilitary forces is clearly directed towards that, to expulse the people, or to convert to Islam, or to be slaughtered.
Okay.
But I do think what's important to say about this, of course, is what's created that monster, and that is what it is, a sectarian monster, is Western military intervention, which has torn the region apart, starting in 2003. And those who are responsible for that mess, just as they were responsible for the mess in 1918, the carve-up in 1918...
Need to come up to the plate and take responsibility. All right, we're going to have to wrap it up there. That's the music. Thank you to all of you for helping us go through history. Keep the conversation going on Twitter and Facebook. Tell me what you think about the show today. You can find me on Facebook, and you can tweet me at Brent Goff TV. And remember, you can watch the show again on YouTube. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. Join me next time when I set the agenda.